I would like to begin by introducing the first of the two directly impacted speakers, Stephen Robert Whitsett. Stephen Robert Whitsett is Director of Human Rights and International Affairs at Just Future Project. Stephen spent 22 years in prison in the state of Florida, and he became one of the first persons in Florida targeted for pre-crime preventative detention. In May 2018, Stephen boarded a plane from Fort Lauderdale, Florida to Oslo, Norway, where he made connections to Hamburg, Germany. He is presently seeking political asylum in Germany from the United States.
Thanks, Garnett. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. In truth, my appearance here today is all the more incredible, considering that I was imprisoned in the United States for more than 22 years, with 18 months in a shadow prison. I'm here to talk to you today about my experience in that shadow prison and to explain why I believe that these legislative schemes violate international human rights law. While serving my country faithfully in the United States Navy as a young man, I was permitted to attend university in order to study psychology. The goal was to attain my commission as a medical officer and continue serving my country. However, in 1994, my career path took an unwelcome turn. As a 22-year-old student, I was arrested by police for an intimate relationship with another young man. The government prosecutors at the time acknowledged that our relationship had been completely consensual. No violence, no threats of violence, no intimidation. But that didn't matter. Regardless of whether the relationship was consensual, under certain circumstances, it is a crime in the state of Florida for anyone to engage in a physical relationship if one of the participants is younger than 18 years of age. Because the law makes all such relationships illegal, I was sent to prison. Throughout my 5 years of imprisonment, my longtime boyfriend faithfully visited me in the prison on every other weekend. He accepted all of my telephone calls and sent food packages to me regularly. During our visits, we dreamt about the life that we would share together after my prison sentence had ended and I had returned home to him. At the end of those 5 long years, that final day of prison had arrived. On that morning, I returned my prison uniform to the guards and dressed myself in civilian clothes. Outside, on the other side of the main gate, my boyfriend sat in his car waiting for me to be released. However, rather than releasing me, prison guards placed handcuffs on my wrists and shackles on my ankles. As I was being forced into an unmarked white van, they informed me that my release had been canceled. Even though I had finished serving my prison sentence, that wasn't good enough. The government wanted more from me. While my boyfriend continued to wait for me, having no idea what was going on, I was instead driven in that unmarked van to an isolated facility several hours away in the middle of a Florida swamp. I would like for you to understand that this last-minute extension of my prison sentence was a complete surprise to me. I had been given no advance notice. I would later learn that just a few months before, the state of Florida had enacted a new law which allows for the continued incarceration of any prisoner convicted of a sex-related crime if, and I ask you to hear me clearly, if government psychologists claim that a particular person is likely to commit a new crime at some point in the future. In other words, those persons who have finished being punished for sex-related crimes they have committed can now be imprisoned for crimes that they might commit in the future. Of course, to continue to hold prisoners indefinitely in a traditional prison after the expiration of their sentence would violate both American law as well as human rights law. In order to get around this inconvenient fact, the Americans simply changed the names of these facilities. Instead of calling them prisons, they call them treatment centers. Today, I'm going to call them what they really are, shadow prisons. There are believed to be about 25 shadow prisons spread across the United States. In my case, I was confined at the Martin Treatment Center. This treatment center was surrounded by a double perimeter fence with the space between them patrolled by armed and uniformed prison guards. The fences were covered with razor wire and motion detectors. On the afternoon that I arrived there, I was met by prison guards who removed the handcuffs and shackles from my wrists and ankles. These same guards forced me to strip completely naked and submit to an invasive body search. They also confiscated all of my personal belongings. When I was escorted inside the main building, I discovered that this treatment center had originally been constructed as an actual prison and had served that purpose for more than 20 years. In converting it to a treatment center, The guards had merely painted a new sign over the front gate. All of the iron bars, all of the barbed wire, all of the stainless steel toilets, all of the metal detectors, all of it had been left in place. This facility had been constructed to ensure that every prisoner could not enjoy the smallest bit of privacy or comfort. Cameras posted in every corner of every room watched our every activity. We could not even be trusted to use the toilet or shower without being observed. The guards at this facility told us that they weren't supposed to call us prisoners, so they literally referred to us as pedophiles and rapists. Whatever they called us, we sure as hell weren't free. Every rule, every facet of our daily routines was designed to humiliate and degrade us, because to them we ultimately weren't human. For example, every 3 hours we were required to sit up on our bunks, face forward, feet on the ground, and remain perfectly silent while guards walked through the dormitories and counted us. The exact same counting procedure as in the regular prisons. When men dared to refuse on the ground that they were no longer prisoners, they would be beaten, gassed, and locked in isolation rooms. This was my life in a shadow prison for 18 months. I was there, I saw it, I lived it. And why was I personally being housed in this shadow prison? Because government psychologists had alleged that at some point in the distant future, I might engage in another consensual relationship with another young man. That's it. Because that is completely, excuse me, behavior that is completely legal in Europe was enough to result in my incarceration in a shadow prison, possibly for the rest of my life. Thankfully, the government didn't have the final say in the matter. In order to indefinitely detain me in a shadow prison after the completion of my sentence, in my case, the government had to convince a jury of my peers that society needed to be protected from me. More than 18 months after my prison sentence had ended, my lawyer managed to get my case in front of a jury. During the trial, the jury listened intently to the testimony of the psychologist provided by the government. The only support for their claim was that I had been in a relationship once with a young man several years before. There was no evidence that I was currently a threat to have another relationship, only that I had done so once in the past. On the other hand, the jury also heard my longtime boyfriend explain that the circumstances of our relationship had been grossly blown out of proportion and that he had been completely willing participant. In the end, the jury decided that I should be released. In other words, the jury determined that the government's claim against me had been wrong. And allow me to emphasize that it was only by the hand of the jury that I was released. Had it been up to the government, I am confident that I would still be confined in that shadow prison today, 22 years later. There are many things wrong, both logically and legally, with publicly labeling fellow citizens as quote-unquote sex offenders, but incarcerating them in shadow prisons, not for crimes they have committed, but for crimes that they might commit, violates international human rights law. Unfortunately, my troubles did not end with my release. After I was released by the jury, the government placed my name on a list published on the internet. This list, available to anyone with internet access, publicly names those in the United States required to register due to past sex-related convictions. And it isn't just their names. This public list also provides their photographs, home addresses, birth dates, and all manner of personal and private data. In my home state of Florida, these persons are required to present themselves to the police at least twice each year in order to have their photographs updated. They may not leave their homes for more than 48 hours unless they first inform the police. In most situations, they are not allowed by law to live in most neighborhoods, not allowed to live near schools or public places. They are no longer allowed to vote in elections. And these restrictions are not for a set period of time. This is often for the rest of their lives. Having my name on this very public list amounts to a life sentence of social death. Because my name and face are on that government list, I had been effectively exiled from society. I could not get a good job, I could not return to university, I could not visit family, and I could not make friends with my neighbors. In the end, I came to believe that no real future existed for me in my own country. No matter how hard I tried or worked, the laws in the United States against those who have been convicted of sex-related crimes ensure that I could never improve my situation. I understood that if I was to have any chance at a normal life, it was going to have to be in another country. In 2017, the United States enacted a new law called the International Megan's Law, which requires that the passports of all citizens convicted of a sex-related crime must bear an identifying marker. By branding the passports of these citizens, the American government aims to restrict their ability to travel internationally. At that point, I feared that the walls were literally closing in on me. As the new law came into effect, I believed that it was time for me to flee the oppression of my own country, to flee the United States in search of freedom somewhere else. These days, I make my home in Germany, where I am currently seeking political asylum. The irony is not lost on me that I fled the supposed land of the free in order to find sanctuary in a country, in this case Deutschland, which perpetrated arguably one of the worst human rights atrocities in recorded history. But the bloodstained Germany of the early 20th century is no more. Rightfully, that Germany has been condemned to the ash heap of history. In its place, a new Germany has arisen, a Germany that stands firmly and unwaveringly on the principles of human rights, on the principle that every human being is worthy of dignity and the opportunity to learn from their mistakes. More broadly, the European Union has emerged as a global leader in human rights. And let us very briefly consider why this is so. The Second World War was fought on European and Asian soil, not American. Thus, the Europeans were first-hand witnesses to the government-sponsored systematic destruction of human life. Jews, gypsies, gays, communists, the mentally and physically infirm, any group that the fascists didn't like or didn't have a use for were rounded up, and eliminated. Vowing to never allow such atrocities to repeat themselves, the nations of Europe bound themselves together in the common cause of protecting human rights to the greatest extent possible by adopting the European Convention on Human Rights. This convention clearly enumerates the specific rights to which every human being is entitled. A few decades later, most member states of the United Nations adopted the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which very closely mirrors the provisions enumerated in the European Convention. I mention this dark period of European history and the empowerment of human rights which resulted in order to draw a contrast between two diverging ideals on two very different continents. The various state and federal governments within the United States have legalized and continue to perpetuate the imprisonment of those whom they deem to be socially undesirable, not for crimes they have committed, but for crimes which they might commit in the future. While I do not challenge a government's authority to define criminal laws and to punish those who violate those laws, I roundly reject the American notion that anyone who has completed their prison sentence can thereafter have their incarceration continued under the guise of treatment. This becomes punishment without end, and I hold, as does the European Union, that once a court-ordered punishment has been completed, that should be the end of it. Article 5 of the European Convention on Human Rights declares that no person can be confined for treatment if they are not of unsound mind. Confining someone who is presently of unsound mind is quite a different animal than confining someone who the state believes might commit a crime in the future. European courts have already had a chance to review this American practice in the case of the Government of the United States versus Roger Allen Geese. In that case, the government closely examined what the American politicians claim about the efficacy of these civil commitment laws, as well as the supposed civil rights safeguards written into them. After listening to experts on both sides of the issue and examining the language of the law itself, the European courts have concluded that these laws are nothing more than window dressing for the continued incarceration of those citizens who have already satisfied their criminal sentences. In short, the courts have determined that through these legislative schemes, the United States is violating the human rights of its own citizens, merely because those citizens are unpopular. The United States voluntarily holds itself up as a champion of human rights. In fact, under the new Biden administration, the United States is seeking a seat on the Human Rights Commission. Given its draconian policies of reducing those convicted of sex-related crimes to social outcasts, and also for confining them not for the sex-related crimes that they have committed, but instead for crimes that they might commit, the United States is in violation of the basic human rights guaranteed by both the European Convention on Human Rights and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. As a result, I call on all good faith member states of the United Nations to hold the United States accountable for its human rights violations against its own citizens. I ask you to demand that these policies be reversed before allowing the United States to hold a seat on any international commission, let alone the Human Rights Commission. I thank the distinguished members of this Congress for this opportunity to speak to you and pray that you will begin the process of restoring the basic human rights of those who have been persecuted within the United States. Thank you.